I'm Maria, and welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time here, I usually talk about social or political commentary. Usually it's more on the political side, but I haven't been feeling that lately, and I've been trying to venture into slightly different content, so that's what this is, I guess. So like pretty much everyone else, I've been spending more time than I care to admit on TikTok. And as TikTok becomes this just like pervasive thing in all of our lives, I've definitely noticed the rise of different aesthetics that are really popularized on TikTok. And I've noticed that like the rise of TikTok aesthetics has kind of officially branched out of TikTok. I follow a lot of different kinds of YouTubers, and I've noticed that quite a few have started talking about TikTok aesthetics. I started thinking about how drastically our conversations around style and even lifestyle have changed in just the last year or two. Like, I remember a few years ago when so many videos on YouTube and so many different decor aesthetics and just a lot of discourse online and in general was all about minimalism. I just kind of started to compare like our culture, especially millennial culture's obsession with minimalism from as recently as 1 or 2 years ago to this rising glorification of new aesthetics that seem to be really vintage inspired on TikTok. So I kind of wanted to examine that a little bit deeper. And today I'm going to be talking a little bit about like the death of millennial minimalism and the rise of the sort of vintage inspired TikTok aesthetic and what that kind of means. So to start, I thought it'd be a good idea to talk a little bit about the rise of minimalism as a style statement and aesthetic, especially in the 2010s in the West. So minimalism rose to just like widespread popularity in Western countries in the 2010s, not just as an aesthetic, but sort of as an overarching way of life. And I don't think it's difficult to imagine why, because millennials who widely came of age in like the 2000s and early 2010s, they grew up with a lot going on. I think the internet as a topic alone, especially as it relates to like the impact of the internet on the generation that was born between the 80s and 90s, is an entire video series topic in and of itself. But I think especially in this context, it's interesting to think about the internet as a source of clutter. You know, despite there being really streamlined and user-friendly websites and increasingly minimal aesthetics online every year, there's no denying that there's just like a pretty overwhelming amount of information to find, opinions to hear, products to buy, and just general noise on the internet. And I think when you take that into account, it's kind of a no-brainer that millennials, who are this interesting generation who were born into a world without internet and then kind of came of age alongside the internet, it's kind of a no-brainer that they would be searching for a little bit of empty space in their lives. But at the same time, I think it's kind of silly to allege that the internet was the only factor that contributed to the rise of minimalism as a trend amongst millennials. Nothing exists in a vacuum, and I think there was a lot going on in the 2000s and 2010s that led to the rise of minimalism amongst coming-of-age millennials. For one, the climate crisis really became a mainstream social and political topic to the point that we really saw the commercialization of climate awareness come about. More and more messages started to inundate the internet about the role of individual responsibility when it came to climate change. More and more messages started to like be spread around the internet, usually by large corporations, about the role of individual responsibility when it comes to taking back control of the climate.
Like, sure, there are hundreds of multinational corporations dumping literal tons of trash into the ocean, but you know, it's our individual responsibility to save the climate.
But my point in saying that is that as more people became increasingly aware of individual responsibility as it relates to climate change, minimalism became an increasingly appealing option because it really afforded people an opportunity to embrace a less wasteful, less cluttered lifestyle. Beyond that, I think another contributing factor to the rise of minimalism among millennials was the fact that a lot of aesthetics and trends are purely reactionary to what just happened in the past. And I think there's no denying that like baby boomers and Gen Xers really loved having a bunch of stuff. Like, we all know the cluttered grandma's house aesthetic. We've all seen those pictures of like Mediterranean style home decor get clowned online. I think as a rule, millennials were born and kind of grew up surrounded by stuff physically, and then they came of age surrounded by stuff both physically and digitally. So millennials did what every other generation has done as a response to the aesthetic and style of the generation before it. They did the exact opposite, and they really embraced minimalism both as a philosophy and as an aesthetic. So before we really dive into minimalism, I think it's important to point out that the idea of minimalism as a philosophy in particular was not innovated by a bunch of young adults and teenagers in the United States or England or other Western countries in the 2010s. The idea that we as human beings should seek to disconnect from the material world in pursuit of emotional, mental, or spiritual clarity has been a prevailing philosophy amongst Eastern and South Asian cultures for literally thousands of years. And funnily enough, despite the emphasis that traditional philosophical minimalism puts on distancing yourself from materials, the growth of minimalism in the West amongst millennials was really related to the commodification of minimalism. And the whole point of minimalism is to have less stuff and to get rid of the stuff that you're not using all the time. And like anything else, of course, the modern sort of Western practice of stylish minimalism existed in varying degrees of commitment. There are plenty of YouTube videos that you can find anywhere about people who literally got rid of everything they owned except for 5 items of clothing, a spoon, a bowl, and basic self-care products. At the same time, and I think to a more widespread degree, there was a significant group of people who adopted some of the aesthetic hallmarks and markers of minimalism without actually committing to the lived reality of a minimalist life philosophy. And of course, I could make an entire video about minimalism growing among Western millennials in and of itself and how it was commodified and marketed to death. But today I'm going to be focusing less on minimalism as a philosophy and more as something that was adopted into a lot of the aesthetic and style expressions of millennials as they came of age. But this week, basically, I'm using millennial minimalism as a springboard to talk about TikTok. So just humor me, hang in there, we're gonna get through this. So conceptually, minimalism isn't at all automatically connected to any kind of aesthetic or color scheme or anything like that. But at the same time, I think if you look at the minimalist aesthetic of millennials in the West, there's a very clear sort of common thread between what the minimalist style looked like. And I think because of the rise of social media platforms like Instagram and Pinterest, there really was sort of that through line because people were able to take inspiration from each other and sort of create an easily identifiable millennial minimalism that was really connected to a sort of futuristic, spacey, athleisure aesthetic as well. So in terms of dressing up and personal style, early 2000s were pretty chaotic. I think all of us can think of Ed Hardy, Von Dutch, just bright colors, low-rise jeans, dresses layered on top of jeans, layered on top of skirts, lots of layers. But that kind of chaotic aesthetic, but I think that chaotic sort of aesthetic of the early 2000s was very quickly replaced by something very different with the rise of social media. Brands like Yeezy in particular, Saint Laurent, Off-White really rose to prominence in the 2010s as just hallmarks of style. Those brands and others like it really were pioneers of a very distinct millennial style that was then seen all over Instagram and social media. That style had some very specific markers. You have muted colors, or just completely monochromatic looks. You have very minimal accessories, and you've got entire outfits that are put together in 1 to 3 pieces. And I think it's interesting that the millennial embracing of this stylized minimalism kind of grew at the same time as this retro futuristic aesthetic. And I think the ultimate example of this is in brands like Yeezy. From the very first season of Yeezy, there's been a distinct monochromatic, hyper streamlined sort of look to each collection. And I think it's interesting because that kind of Yeezy aesthetic really is kind of a callback to what a lot of movies from the 60s, 70s, and 80s kind of predicted our style would look like. A lot of athleisure, a lot of clear fabrics, a lot of spandex and rubber, but in very streamlined ways. I think this like retro futuristic look really rose around the same time as minimalism became a widespread trend, to the point that there was a lot of overlap between the two in personal style. And of course, like the style that was pioneered by brands like Yeezy and Off-White was very quickly replicated by fast fashion retailers like Forever 21 and H&M and Zara and so many others. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that these fast fashion retailers or even high fashion designers were exclusively creating ultra minimalist looks. We've all seen like the cringy Forever 21 bright colored like slogan t-shirts. Those, unfortunately, I think aren't going away anytime soon. But what fast fashion retailers did was really make that ultra streamlined minimalist aesthetic accessible to pretty much anyone, not just the people who could afford brands like Saint Laurent and Off-White. And the thing about minimalism in and of itself as sort of a style philosophy is nothing new. Like, less is more has been sort of a classic saying when it comes to personal style. So the idea that fashion is more chic or more interesting when there's less going on is nothing new by any means. But I think that this combination of minimalism in the form of less individual pieces and less colors per outfit, combined with this like hyper futuristic aesthetic, was definitely a distinctive part of the 2010s. That's very clearly seen by the fact that like Vogue's Met Ball in 2016 was Manus Ex Machina, which is literally all about fashion in the age of technology. And if you look at a lot of the attendees, you see a lot of monochrome, a lot of minimal accessories, and a lot of hyper futuristic looks. And like it or not, two of the most prominent fashion figures of the 2010s are Kim Kardashian and Kanye West, and they really popularized the Yeezy aesthetic through social media to an unprecedented degree, and they really helped to set the tone for style in the 2010s.
Not the Trump hat though. Kanye never really made that one a thing.
And like clothing was not the only place where this like commodified minimalism was seen. I think even in home decor, it's very evident that minimalist aesthetics, if not the spirit of minimalism itself, were embraced. Cringy Cheesecake Factory looking houses that we clown on TikTok now were swiftly replaced in the 2010s by houses that were very geometric in shape, very monochromatic, streamlined with very few decorative pieces, and just like very little clutter in general. And I think what's interesting too is even spaces in millennial homes that like couldn't help but be cluttered, things like bookshelves and pantries, they were made to look more aesthetically streamlined and more minimalistic, even if they inherently weren't. Like you see rainbow bookshelves where the eye is drawn to one color at a time, and then you see these pantries where like there are no labels, there are no cereal boxes, you've just got like glass containers. I think those are prime examples of the way that minimalism as this commodified aesthetic trend was incorporated into spaces where it clearly wasn't like a practiced philosophy. And then the last example of just like widespread millennial minimalism that I'm going to talk about is also the most blatantly commercialized one, which is marketing. Ironically enough, the most distinct and obvious kind of manifestation of the minimalist aesthetic was in marketing, aka selling people stuff, aka the thing that you're not really supposed to do according to minimalist philosophy. There's been a very clear shift that especially like millennials and those of us on the cusp between millennials and Gen Z have been very aware of, which is like the transition from the super bright colors and crazy fonts and like fun mascots of products in the 2000s and 1990s. But that went away in the 2010s. Like all of a sudden it wasn't about bright colors and crazy logos. Like brand packaging became super sleek, super minimal. The less text and just general stuff on a package, the better. Millennial pink, which was like one of the colors of the year in the late 2010s, became a hallmark of millennial marketing, usually as an accent color surrounded by white with some sort of like geometric font. Honestly, the only word I need to say is glossier, and I think everyone knows what I'm talking about. So brands caught on to the fact that minimalism was very appealing to millennials, if not as an actual practice philosophy, then definitely as an aesthetic. And ironically enough, brands used the aesthetic of minimalism to appeal to millennials and sell them more stuff. So having talked about sort of the rise of minimalism, or at least a very watered down commodified version of minimalism, we can talk about TikTok and the death of this commodified millennial minimalist aesthetic. Just like Insta baddie makeup and fast fashion and other hallmarks of like millennials coming of age, this like futuristic minimalist aesthetic is still around, but it's no longer perceived as like the latest, exciting, fresh thing. What I think is interesting about millennial minimalism is that it was every bit as impactful and like as distinctive of its generation as like the bright colors of the 80s or the grunge of the 90s. Like, I have a feeling that in 20 or 30 years, when kids have like 2010s themed parties, there's gonna be a lot of Yeezys and a lot of like spandex and just like a lot of monochromatic looks in general. I think those are kind of gonna be like the takeaways from a lot of millennial fashion in the 2010s. So although it's definitely been an important sort of hallmark of Western aesthetic, like fashion history, millennial minimalism was also relatively short-lived. Like, if we're using Yeezy as a reference point, which I do because I really think it was a definitive aesthetic of its time, the lifespan of like this futuristic minimalist style was really about 4 years, from like 2015 to 2019 at best. And I think with the rise of TikTok as this huge cultural touchstone in 2019 and 2020, that's really begun to change. So with the rise of TikTok has come the popularization of a few different TikTok aesthetics. So I'm gonna be talking about 5 main aesthetics that I think are probably some of the most popular on TikTok. Each of these is super different, but I think they all have something really important in common that I'm gonna talk about later. So the first one is the one that at least I think I've seen the most content about, both on TikTok and on YouTube and other platforms, and that's cottagecore. So cottagecore is this very soft, kind of dreamy aesthetic that really idealizes like rural life. It uses a lot of fabrics like cotton in both clothing and home decor. There's a lot of floral motifs and a lot of like light earth tones. Think like Little Women or any Jane Austen book, and you've got a pretty good sense of where cottagecore draws its inspiration from. The next aesthetic is dark academia. As the name suggests, is dark. This aesthetic kind of draws from a mixture of gothic themes in architecture, dark emotional themes like death, unrequited love, kind of just general spookiness and hauntings, and of course academic settings, you know, like libraries at old universities. It really glamorizes this like 19th century dark castle vibe. The best way I can kind of describe it in my head is like, think Hogwarts Castle meets Edgar Allan Poe. And I think that like this aesthetic has been really popular, especially in shows and movies that have sinister or creepy themes. Like, I think The Vampire Diaries, despite being a 2010s show, really has like dark academia vibes, even if there wasn't necessarily a name for it back then. The Picture of Dorian Gray, both the book and the movie, are a great example of this. I think Knives Out is a good example as well. The next big TikTok aesthetic is light academia. Light academia is, wait for it, a lighter take on dark academia. I would think of like a cool, trendy, like well-lit coffee shop in Williamsburg or Portland where like you might see someone using a typewriter to work on their novel. But just think of like really romanticized 20th century vintage academic settings with an urban contemporary twist. I would say like The Great Debaters, if you've seen that movie, is a really good example of the light academia vibe. Even Good Will Hunting is a good example of that as well. And the next aesthetic that I'm going to talk about is quite different from the academia ones. It's the soft girl aesthetic. The soft girl aesthetic is just unapologetically feminine and intentionally cutesy. It embraces things like pink and pastels and girly cartoon characters and really traditionally feminine symbols like lace, bows, and hearts. I think the best example of like the soft girl aesthetic is the girly girl that's seen in anime. And finally, the last big TikTok aesthetic that I'm going to be covering today is the e-girl and e-boy kind of style. So this style really fully embraces internet subculture and really romanticizes the internet subculture of like the late 2000s and early 2010s that in and of itself was quite different from the prevailing rise of minimalism amongst the general culture. The e-girl and e-boy style really combines more contemporary silhouettes with really recognizable pop punk staples of the early 2000s. You've got things like multicolored hair, plaid, stripes, black, and there's a lot of touches of like anime inspired style. I would say like Billie Eilish is a perfect example of this, and I think she's someone that a lot of people who are kind of favor the e-girl, e-boy style tend to emulate. If not in like the bagginess of her clothing, then definitely in the aesthetic and the overall color schemes that she goes for. So that's just kind of a general overview of the main TikTok aesthetics, and obviously, each is very different, but each of these aesthetics has something important in common. They completely reject millennial minimalism, completely reject like monochromatic looks that are very streamlined, and each of these styles finds a unique way to really embrace maximalism. For example, cottagecore is all about like nostalgia for these like romantic elements of pre-industrial life. It places this emphasis on like aesthetically mismatched clutter. It goes completely against the sharp angles and the intentional sort of barrenness of millennial minimalism. At the same time, academia might be a lot of things, but it's not minimal. And I think both light and dark academia really romanticize these periods of the past during which being surrounded by books and dramatic architecture and really like statement making style are big hallmarks, and none of those things is necessarily inherently minimalistic. And I think finally it's easy to see that both the soft girl and e-girl and e-boy aesthetics have a lot more in common with the chaotic early 2000s looks I mentioned earlier than the millennial minimalist aesthetic of the 2010s. And I think all of these up and coming aesthetics that are being really celebrated and embraced by Gen Z, it just goes to show how reactionary style is. And I think interestingly enough, another thing that each of those 5 aesthetics has in common is that in their unique ways, each one embraces a distinct time period in the past. Cottagecore, like I said, is pretty closely associated with rural life in like the 17 and 1800s. I think which is why Jane Austen is such like a perfect aesthetic representation of cottagecore inspo. Dark academia is all gothic, all romantic, baby, like no question about it. Light academia, I think, definitely harkens back to like 1940s and 50s collegiate aesthetics. Both the soft girl and boy aesthetics, like I said, are very evocative of like the early 2000s bright colors. And I think examining like these different TikTok aesthetics and comparing them to the millennial minimalism that we're kind of leaving behind, it makes me ask a few questions. Like, could it be possible that as our forward progress becomes more and more exponential with the internet, our nostalgia does too? Like, why aren't we choosing to embrace like futurism in our personal style and in our home decor when futurism is definitely being embraced by things like cars and computers and iPhones? Like, those things are only becoming sleeker and sleeker. I think that these nostalgic TikTok aesthetics are a way for Gen Z, which is a generation of digital natives, you know, like they were literally born into the age of the internet. I think it's a way to kind of evoke and preserve like emotional rawness and just general ruggedness in our increasingly automated and sanitized and just like technologically driven world. I think the faster we propel forward, and we are propelling forward faster than ever, the more tempted we become to romanticize the nostalgia of the time periods that we're leaving behind. If not socially, which we definitely shouldn't romanticize the past socially, then for sure aesthetically. But I'd love to hear what you guys think. Where do you think these rising TikTok aesthetics come from? Why do you think it is that that even though these like 5 aesthetics are so different from each other, the biggest things they have in common are rejecting minimalism and embracing time periods of the past. I would love to hear what your thoughts are, and I hope you like this video. I know it's a little bit different. I know I kind of jumped all over the place, but I had a lot of fun putting this together and researching, and I hope you had fun watching it. Please let me know what you think. Thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to, and I look forward to seeing you next week.